مساء الخير جميعا ويعطيكم العافية على الجلد والصبر اللي يعني حتى الساعة يعني الخامسة يعني من الصبح لهلا تقريبا على دفعة واحدة من الأبحاث والعروضات. رح أتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية، لكن إنه في أي أسئلة بدها تكون باللغة العربية أو باللغة الإنجليزية أنا مستعد إنه أجاوبها باللغة المناسبة. Okay. So this research is, or maybe this presentation is about decolonizing early childhood education practices and research in the Arab world. Okay, I think you know. Okay, so just to start to talk about it and talk about decolonizing early childhood education in the Arab world, we need to understand that the early childhood education is about, you know, the development in different aspects, in the cognitive, emotional, social, and also physical. And all of these aspects actually will develop by time, and if we invest actually in the beginning of this early childhood, it means that we'll be having you know, a life return over the course of all the you know, stages in the individual's life. So that's really very important. But despite this global recognition about the early childhood education, we still this ECE remains one of the most inequitable and undeveloped sectors in the world compared to others in the school system. So that's important to understand and to have it as beginning. And to understand also the context or the problem of this issue, we need to understand that approximately half the world's pre-primary age children, around 175 million, are not enrolled in any organized learning program, which means here we're talking about the early childhood program. And 80% of these children live in low-income countries. So this is staggering, actually, when talking about them. In the Arab region, the gross enrollment ratio for ages 3 to 4 averaged 27% in 2016. Okay, maybe it increased a bit, but still it's not up to our ambitions. And that disparity actually between the countries is really telling about, you know, this inequity or inequitable, I would say, education around the world and also in the Arab world. When talking about decolonizing education, it's a multifaceted approach to education that actively challenges and dismantles colonial structures, ideologies, and practices within education systems. And it's important to understand that. And this colonial education, I need to stress here, is not always external. It could be also internal, and I'm going to explain this. So it aims to create more equitable and inclusive learning environments by catering marginalized perspectives. So here we've got here very noble aim, which is to have more equitable and inclusive environments. And especially for those who are underprivileged, the indigenous or the local communities. So again, decolonizing education, especially for the ECE, is not about rejecting all external influence, and it's important to understand that. So we need not to shut all the doors here, but we need to be always open to internal, let's say, abilities and capabilities you've got in our own culture or our local cultures. And within the Arab world, we can talk about multiple cultures, by the way, so diverse cultures. It's about reclaiming the right to define what constitutes quality early learning in each community, embedding cultural identity, linguistic rights, and social justice. And those three important principles, if you call them, or values, are really important for any community to upscale its education, not only in the early childhood education, but in general. So why decolonize ECEC and CARE, of course? Here, colonial and post-colonial systems continue to shape education policies and priorities. In the courses I'm teaching at the American University of Beirut, I ask my students, for example, to do some experiments like those about the three attachment, the attachment theory and three different attachments according to Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, and they replicate the same. Exactly the same, but they find different. The findings would be like really different from the ones Mary Ainsworth found, and the same with the conservation tasks by Piaget. So many of my students, they've done the same experiments. They found some different, findings, completely different findings. Some students say were accelerated, and they understood the conservation tasks much more. Others maybe they have some different also. Attachment, when talking about attachment theory, different attachment styles. So the cultural difference here is important to consider. So this is really very important to have in mind. So we're talking about also the theoretical background. It's not only the research, the theoretical background of any developmental, let's say, phase, which is whether it's going to be the cognitive or social, should be sometimes questioned in our cultures. And also in the Arab world, these legacies are compounded with post-colonial political economies, donor dependency, and in many contexts, protracted crisis as well. So all of those actually will be exceptional. I would say the crises in our region, they're much more exceptional to any other region. So you need also to consider with any kind of developmental phases among children when it comes to those crises. And research and practices are dominated by Western theories, as I mentioned before, and benchmarks. So all the benchmarks, or sometimes one's talking about milestones of development, whether cognitive or social or emotional. We're referring to certain milestones done by Piaget or Vygotsky, or maybe referring to this theory or that theory, or Bowlby and so. So we need also to question all of these theories, or maybe sometimes to think about, how they relate to our own cultural context. So some theories are culturally specific. So we need also to question that. So decolonization in early childhood education can be understood along 4 dimensions from my point of view. So the first one, the epistemic decolonization, which is creating local knowledge based on our culture and our context. So lots of research could be done about this to produce some knowledge that's really important for the kids within that local culture. The linguistic decolonization, this is another thing to consider. So it's worrying when seeing some kids that their Arabic is, for example, is the first language, the spoken, or maybe their English is the first language, as a spoken language, but in writing it could be something else, or the other way around. So once asking the kid, what's your first language, the kid will be distracted or maybe sometimes confused. Some kids, their first language at home, it's Arabic, but when it comes to writing, it's English. So lots of confusing matters should be here taken into consideration in the early childhood education in particular, because it's the first phase and the most critical one. So we're not saying or suggesting that the students, they shouldn't learn additional languages, just to stress on that point. In the contrary, but we need to start from our home, let's say, language. The pedagogical decolonization is another. And this is what I meant by also the colonization is not necessarily to be only external, but also internal. So the rote memorization, the kind of dictating, the kind of instruction, is also another form of colonization, colonizing the minds of the kids. So that's another aspect. So some of them, they come from our also, let's say, made up instructions that the kids should be passive learners, they should be recipient, or sometimes even obedience. So this is another form of colonization from my point of view. And the structural decolonization is another, which is about reforming governance, funding, and teacher preparations. As one of the presenters said, I think Dr. Matar, so some of the NGOs, they come and train teachers and then disappear. And we don't have any actually accountability or sometimes some studies to tell the effectiveness of that training. So there is no sustainable or sustained training sometimes. Here it's all related to funding, it's all related to the governance as well. So once the private sector or NGOs, they will be having the upper hand in such education, then we have maybe to bear the consequences. The historical context of the ECE in the Arab world might fall under maybe, or maybe we can discuss three things under such context. The legacies of the colonial education, the post-independence reforms, and the neoliberal and donor-driven reforms. For the first one, I think maybe most of us understand that the effect or the consequence of colonization in different regions in the world. For example, in the North Africa, French colonial policies focused on assimilating elites through French language education during the colonization, and they weren't interested in early childhood education whatsoever. In the Levant, the British and French mandates encouraged French and English and Western curricula. Also, early childhood education wasn't that promoted. During the Ottoman education system, the Ottoman left the legacy of centralized control and religious schooling, mainly. And, during such provisions under the colonial regimes, there were such minimal, let's say, work, or maybe for the education, for the early childhood education in the rural areas. Usually it's in the urban areas and mostly for elites. And this is another aspect, such disparity between regions and between classes. So that's another aspect of colonization, whether internal or external. Some examples, when it comes to Palestine and Lebanon, they've got such fragmented governance, leaving the ECE to NGOs with no unified policy, mostly. And I should be honest about this, because sometimes we might be diplomatic maybe in presenting the issues, but we have to present it as is. UNRWA excludes kindergarten, and this kindergarten term even is not within our maybe culture. So I can maybe mention two things, the kindergarten and the preschool education. Who said that the pre-primary education is a preschool education? It's another type of schooling, isn't it? So it's another type of schooling. So why you're calling it preschooling education, for example? So we even adopted some terms as is without questioning them. I like Riyad al-Atfal in Arabic. So this is a nice one, okay? So we can accept some terms, but we need to question also some other terms as well. So we can say pre-primary education, but is it preschool education really? In the UK, they have 13 years of schooling, including 1 year, which is the pre-primary. And in Belfast, Ireland, and I think the Republic of Ireland, they've got 14 years of schooling, mandatory schools of schooling, including the pre-primary, 2 years pre-primary. So we need also to think about terminology that we're using sometimes. So such, action, or let's say decision by UNRWA, that's only the basic education. In Jordan until maybe the grade 10, in Lebanon grade 12, but there is no pre-primary education. This creates what? This creates some inequity among many of the people who are attending schools. Some they attend the pre-primary education and others not. So it's like treating pre-primary education as a social welfare rather than rights to learn. And that's another aspect. And this reproduced inequalities, as I said, of having overcrowded classrooms, limited infrastructure, inconsistent pedagogies, resulting in uneven developmental outcomes in general. We have the other phase, which is the post-independence reform, when many Arab states embarked on Arabization policies to replace colonial languages with Arabic in public education. So the colonial languages often retain dominance, particularly in the private sector and private schools. But there's some the expansion in the ECE schools as well. They were slow in these countries. And in some, it's almost zero. Like in Libya, for example, during Gaddafi regime, he was totally against the early childhood education. And I do remember one of his speeches when he said, why to have kids in the early childhood education or the pre-primary education? What about their moms? What they're going to do? So we have a complete different paradigm here. So we cannot blame only, I would say, the external factors or the external, let's say, countries for sometimes suppressing or maybe, I would say, manipulating or maybe, let's say, controlling our system, but also we've got our own issues as well. The neoliberal and donor-driven reforms is also another thing you can find in many countries. You can find it in Lebanon, you can find it in Jordan, in Palestine, in Egypt. This is another thing that's really influencing and impacting the education because it's short-term impact. It has short-term impact, but not long-term impact. We have such over-reliance on the external fund. And once it stops, so we'll be having issues here with the, let's say the rate of enrollment, could be the sustained education or the quality of education or the teacher preparation. So that's all actually something that is really still impacting our countries, probably not the Gulf countries, but some Arab countries. This is the current state of the ECE in the Arab world. Maybe some figures not necessarily to be very much accurate, but based on some references. Some of them they refer to the years 2021, others maybe 2025. But you can see the disparity here between some selected countries, United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco, and Yemen. So in United Arab Emirates, here the enrollment, the gross enrollment ratio is 95%, where compared to Yemen it's 10%. So this tells also about some regional disparities, isn't it, in enrollment. In Morocco, for example, there are such disparities also in its internal regions, whether you compare between the rural and urban. So most of the elite, education could be the urban areas at the expense of the rural areas. And I would say this is the case also in Saudi Arabia and many other similar countries. So the same applies to the teacher workforce and the governance and regulation. So you can see here the variance or the disparity between the Gulf countries where they have the ratio of 8:1 when it comes to teacher-child ratios, compared to, let's say, 30:1 in Sudan or Yemen. And many teachers, they lack specialized also qualifications. In Lebanon, only 38%. The KG teachers, called KG teachers, also hold a degree in early childhood education. When it comes to the governance and regulation, again, it's fragmented, between different ministries. And I think it was mentioned somehow in Palestine, where some maybe they hold some responsibilities in the Ministry of Education, other maybe in the social affairs, the same in some other Arab countries as well. So once you've got such conflict between the ministries, it means you'll be having conflicts in the laws, regulations, decrees sometimes, and that might be at the expense also of the advancement of the field itself. We can see in some countries, like in Lebanon, the private sector is much stronger than the public sector. In fact, the private sector preceded the establishment of the country, well, hundreds of years ago. Maybe if you can talk about sometimes some schools, they were established 300 years or 500 years before the foundation of the state. Unlike Jordan, for example, Jordan, no, it was based on, as a country on public sector. So you can see, for example, the Jordanian public universities, they are much stronger than the private ones, and so on. So the same here about the absence of public sector engagement and over-reliance on private provision, as I said. You can see it in Jordan and Tunisia as example. You can see also the difference between the upper and middle class people when it comes to having their kids in the pre-primary schools, and so on. So we've got also the aspect of socio-economic inequalities within each country as well, especially the poorest countries. The governmental fund and support, I think we spoke about this. We can take the example of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon. So mainly, I would say it's in Lebanon, you can say the same about Egypt, the private sector, and when it comes to the pre-primary education is much stronger. In Saudi Arabia, I would say they face challenges related to the insufficient government funding, especially in rural areas. So they have such a disparity, it's obvious, like in Morocco. In Jordan, also the same. In Lebanon. So, but we can add also the issue of the refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. So another thing that it puts lots of burden on both countries when it comes to accommodating kids to this early childhood education schooling system. Some of the refugees who came from Syria, they were accommodated in UNRWA schools, but also to maybe some centers that catered by some NGOs, whether Palestinians or Lebanese as well. Regional disparities, I think we mentioned this. Okay, in Morocco, for example, in Tunisia, the same. So the services in different regions, they are not equal, mainly because of the fund, again, and because of the lack of public expenditures on the early childhood education. What about research gaps? So again, as I said before, we have lots of research, as some said, okay, but how many we've got that's questioning certain theories, or maybe I would say producing knowledge about a new theory in development of the kids, okay, whether it's about social, cognitive, or emotional aspects. How many? I think many of the research done is just a replica of some research done in the West. And this is not a kind of work or maybe knowledge that's going to be helpful for the decision makers and the policy makers, because once we'll be also having some, I would say, conversation or talk or professional communication with the policy makers, any kind of policy should be based on the work and theoretical background we've got from our own local culture or communities. So we have limited data on refugee, I would say, refugees' pre-primary experiences due to political marginalization. We might have actually some research, lots of research done by UNRWA. It's not shared. I know that many of them, they are not shared. Many of the NGOs, they do some research for their own, and they keep it for their own. They don't publish them. And this is really a problematic thing in research. So if the over-reliance on NGOs, I can mention, like, for example, USAID. We work with the USAID. We worked with the Europeans. We worked with UNICEF, with the UNESCO. Many of the work done, and I've done myself with them, was not publishable, and they prohibited us from publishing them. So that's also another issue, I would say. Though it's it's amazing work, lots of cross-cultural, cross-country studies sometimes done, unlike the work done by Arab Network for child education. So it's publishable, it's known, we present about it, but NGOs work actually, especially external NGOs, they keep the copyrights of the work to themselves. They don't publish them mostly. I would say we need to have more of participatory research with Arab educators, families, and children. And we can find that most of the research done published in English. Okay, I'm not against that. I publish in English, but also we need to publish in Arabic. We need to reach more audience. Probably we need to have sometimes the abstracts written in English and Arabic in some Arab journals. So that's important for reaching more audience. It would be really paradoxical once you conduct a research to a certain audience, okay, maybe American audience, European audience, in some American journals or outlets, but your main or intent is to benefit your own local who are not able to read what you've done. So we need to find somewhere, I would say, to help and to maybe move from reaching more of our own community about this. There are some good journals in Arabic. I published in one of them, but I can maybe have also some criticism of my work. So maybe most of my research done in English. So we need also to work on ourselves to publish in both. I publish in Arabic and English, but mostly more in English. The Gulf states, now it comes when talking about, Gulf states compare some others, we can see some here also, they have maybe the highest ECE enrollment rates in the region, often exceeding 90%. The provision is heavily dominated by private providers, many of which follow Western and international curricula. So it sounds nice, good, we have high enrollment. But almost nothing about the local culture. It's all based on Western theories. So even the education nowadays in the Gulf countries, it's based on the, A-level, I would say the maybe advanced diplomas and so on. So how to create or maybe prepare this global citizen who knows a lot about the world, but little about localities. Bahrain and Oman have initiated efforts to localize their curricula, incorporating Arabic literature and regional environmental themes into early years programs. And in a book was published just 2 months ago, and I participated in this book in a chapter about Lebanon, early childhood education in Lebanon. So in this book, it's about the early childhood education in the Mediterranean, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, Libya, and I think Algeria. They had chapters in this book. It's interesting to read about those chapters and also to compare between the different countries. There are some others, of course, about Greece, Cyprus, Italy, Croatia. But you can maybe read about the same things I mentioned about Lebanon, for example, the NGOs leading the KG education and Palestinian refugees education. And in Palestine, the political instability and occupation fragment the ECEC systems, undermining children's rights to consistent access, And in Egypt and Libya, the colonial histories and post-revolution instabilities show how governance gaps hinder the EC expansion. So if going more in detail, in Palestine, again, as I said, the ECE provision is fragmented across public, private, and NGO sectors. We said the GER is relatively high, which is like 79% in 2022, but access is severely disrupted in conflict-affected areas, especially in Gaza. And we've got here the systematic destruction of the schools nowadays in Gaza, as you can know, and they destroyed most of the schools, the pre-primary education centers or schools, the only school for the gifted and talented, which is I'm interested in. So we have lots of destruction, or maybe sometimes you call the educide, or genocide education in Gaza nowadays. That's affecting really what's going on, not only the early childhood education, but also the education in general. And adding to this, the UNRWA is the only, almost maybe the main, let's say, provider of education there, and it's not providing education for the pre-primary kids. So this adding to the problem again. The funding is just, year by year. You just wait for what UNRWA or NGOs will be providing you with. So that's also another issue. So the structural inequalities, because of the occupation, which is directly affecting access, the movement, also the destruction, it causes the destruction of the facilities, all actually impacting what's going on in early childhood education. And in the Palestine, the ECE struggles illustrate how colonial occupation perpetuates dependence on the NGOs and donors, as I said. Libya, I would say, completely different case. So as I said before, it wasn't that affected by the colonial legacy, okay? At that time, there was no attempt by the Italians, for example, to establish early childhood education centers or schools. And even after or during Gaddafi regime, he was almost against it. So there's still baby steps nowadays in Libya. I've been in Libya. I visited the schools. I've seen how they're doing. They're trying their best, but still I would say there is no system there. And this is what's maybe making it difficult for them. So we have lots of things here related, as I said before. So the authoritarian regime, it is more of like colonial one that's, impacted this education. So suddenly you can change the system, overnight, or maybe sometimes you decide, yes, let's go for early childhood education. So we have such sudden decisions that might impact the whole society without going through the, such evolution or maybe such development through stages. Egypt saw a decade of instability following the 2011 revolution, which affected the education sector, including the early education, early childhood education. So the provision, there is such significant maybe growth in the number on the enrollment of them since 2000, but it slowed down later after 2012. Again, we have some issues related to the donors, related to the governance, how it goes. So I would say quite similar sometimes to what's going on in Lebanon. So the conclusion, we need to have conclusion towards decolonized practices. Decolonizing education in general, or early childhood education, reclaiming education as cultural survival, resilience, and justice. It requires dismantling inherited inequalities from colonial governance and door-driven agendas. Arab-led community-driven models can ensure children's right to equity, belonging, and quality early learning. And these case studies that we discussed about different countries, they reveal how decolonizing ECE in the Arab world required shifting from donor-driven, fragmented, and crisis-responsive models to rights-based, locally led, culturally grounded systems. Also, we need to embrace critical pedagogy that links children's learning to social realities of war, displacement, and inequalities, and invest in teacher professional development rooted in cultural and linguistic diversity, not just imported curriculum. When it comes to research recommendations, we need to use methodological approaches such as participatory action research, community-based participatory research, and having some cross-Arab early childhood education studies like the ones that we're doing. So this is for decolonizing, the early childhood education. You need to design studies that reflect children's lived realities through culturally relevant tools like play-based interviews, drawings, and storytellings, and center Arab educators and families in knowledge production. So we need also to target all of those participants and embed local knowledge and languages in research as well. When it comes to understand the research and to implement what we said, we can also maybe do something about the policy at that stage. We cannot jump to the policy without being able to deal with the research issues here, I would say, or gaps. So the following policy directions synthesize insights from the preceding analysis and align with the 4 dimensions of the decolonization: epistemic, linguistic, pedagogical, and structural. So we can start with the legislative and governance reforms, which is within the structural one. So we need to have unified ECE framework that consolidates the governance under one single national body or well-coordinated interministerial council to standardize the quality, the teacher preparation, and monitoring as well. And we need to have legal guarantees for ECE, which is enshrine universal access to at least 1 year of free pre-primary education. So for all of the kids, for equity and quality here. Integration of, with social protection, we need to link the ECE provision to child health, nutrition, and social safety net programs to address multiple dimensions, not only one dimension, multiple dimensions here of child well-being. Epistemic and linguistic decolonization, the home language instruction is important. Since we've got here the mother language, we need also to think about it as language of instruction in addition to some others, as I said, okay? So it's research found that it's much more important to teach kids multiple languages. But you need to start with their own language for their mental and cognitive flexibility. That's essential. And for metalinguistic awareness. Kids who are speaking more than one language, they've got more metalinguistic awareness. However, the ones who are starting with their own language, then studying other languages, they'll be having even much more higher levels of metalinguistic awareness. The local curriculum development here, that's important to collaborate with local educators, cultural practitioners to integrate local stories, games, and problem-solving approaches, and the knowledge sovereignty, which is establishing national research centers. There are maybe some already established, but not enough to produce the knowledge that we're seeking for. Okay, as I said, it's not only a replica of some other previous research, but to produce some new knowledge based on our context, to generate locally relevant data and reduce dependency on external studies. So the pedagogical reform, we need to have some play-based, culturally responsive pedagogy, shifting from rote memorization, as I said, to have more critical thinker kids. And we need to emphasize more on the social and emotional aspect, especially given the crises that we're going through, the traumas that many of the kids are going through. This is maybe, probably we're not exclusive to this compared to some other regions, but we might be exceptional in these days. Also, the inclusive education is essential to ensure sustained teacher preparation, including strategies for including children with disabilities, refugee children, and linguistic diversity. So funding, I think we mentioned this before, it's important not to over-rely on the external fund. So the progressive public funding, the having more, let's say, of public expenditures on the early childhood education is important. In Lebanon, for example, the expenditures on education in general during the 70s was 22% out of the whole budget. You know, but nowadays we've got it only 4%. Jordan is the same, 3.2%. So that's really low compared to many other, let's say, countries around the world. We're talking about education in general, not early childhood education, education in general. So reduced donor dependency, as we said, and the public-community partnership. This is important to support community-led ECE centers with public funding and technical support to strengthen local ownership. I can end here with the references, and here, and finally, لتظل ذاكرتنا شاهدة على الحرب استهدفت حروب أطفالنا وأقلامهم في غزة.